The year was 1962, a time when the world held its breath, suspended by the thin, fraying wire of nuclear deterrence. But while the masses stared at the skies in fear of missiles, a much darker reality was unfolding beneath the permafrost of the Siberian wasteland. You are listening to Eldermurk, where the truth isn't just hidden. It's buried under layers of classified steel and frozen blood. What I am about to tell you comes from a dossier recovered from a facility that officially never existed. A facility known only as Site 9. The wind howled across the tundra like a dying beast, carving jagged paths through the endless white. Major Viktor Volkov pulled his heavy wool coat tighter, the bitter cold of the Soviet North biting through even the thickest layers. He stood on the edge of a massive excavation pit, his eyes fixed on a metallic structure protruding from the ice. It wasn't steel. It wasn't iron. It was a matte black substance that seemed to swallow the dim light of the Arctic sun. Major, a voice cracked through the wind. It was Dr. Arisov, the lead scientist on the project. His face was pale, his hands trembling, not from the cold, but from what they found an hour ago. The drilling team, they broke through the inner hull, were picking up signals, not radio waves, something biological. Volkov didn't flinch. He was a man of the state, a veteran of the Great Patriotic War. But even his iron nerves felt a tremor. Biological? At this depth? This craft has been encased in ice for at least 10,000 years, Doctor. Nature didn't build this, Major, and whatever is inside, it's still dreaming. Continuing with deep narrative building, describing the descent into craft, the oppressive silence of the corridors, the discovery of the first sleeper pod, and the growing sense of dread as the military personnel realize this isn't a weapon of their enemies, but something from beyond the stars. The air inside the craft was heavy, smelling of ozone and ancient dust, as Volkov and his tactical team moved deeper into the labyrinthine halls. Their flashlights cut through a darkness that felt thick, almost liquid. The walls were covered in pulsating veins of dim violet light. It was as if the ship itself were breathing, a slow, rhythmic pulse that echoed in the marrow of their bones. "Look at the carvings," whispered Sergeant Petrov, pointing his rifle toward a frieze on the wall. It depicted stars that didn't belong to any known constellation, and figures that were tall, spindly, and devoid of faces. They weren't just visiting Earth. They were harvesting it. Suddenly, a high-pitched hum filled the corridor. The violet veins on the walls flared to a blinding brilliance. One by one, the electronic devices the team carried, the Geiger counters, the radios, the lanterns, began to whine and fail. "Return to the surface. That's an order," Volkov shouted, but his voice was drowned out by a sound that wasn't a sound at all. It was a thought, a collective, crushing thought that slammed into their minds like a physical blow. "We are awake." Petrov dropped his rifle, his hands clutching his head as blood began to seep from his ears. The others fell to their knees, paralyzed by the telepathic weight of an intelligence that had been waiting for the ice to thin, waiting for the right moment to reclaim what it had left behind. Volkov struggled to draw his pistol, his vision blurring. In the strobe-like flashes of the dying lights, he saw it. At the end of the hall, a circular hatch was sliding open, not with mechanical hiss, but with the wet, organic sound of heart valve opening. A shape began to emerge, a silhouette that defied the laws of human anatomy, translucent and shimmering with a cold, predatory light. The Cold War was no longer about ideologies. It was no longer about East versus West. As Volkov felt his consciousness slipping away into the void, he realized a terrifying truth. The secret files weren't meant to protect the state. They were meant to hide the fact that humanity was never the master of this planet. We were merely the caretakers of a garden, and the owners had finally returned to harvest. The silhouette emerging from the hatch was not a solid form, but shimmering distortion of reality, as if the air itself had been bruised and broken. Major Volkov's fingers felt like lead as he tried to grip the cold grip of his Makarov pistol. The creature, if it could be called that, didn't walk, it unfolded. It moved with a sickening fluidity, its limbs elongating and snapping into place like a series of geometric equations being solved in real time. The violet light from the walls cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of the objects casting them. This was the moment the world changed, not with a nuclear flash, but but with the silent arrival of an ancient predator. "Back! Get back!" Volkov roared, finally finding his voice through the crushing mental pressure. He fired 3 rounds into the center of the shimmering mass. The bullets didn't ricochet. They simply vanished into the creature's translucent torso, ripples spreading outward like stones thrown into a stagnant pond. The entity paused, its lack of a face somehow conveying a sense of profound, cold curiosity. It leaned toward the fallen Sergeant Petrov, who was still convulsing on the floor. A thin, needle-like appendage extended from the entity's chest, vibrating at a frequency that turned Petrov's screams into a wet, rattling gurgle. In an instant, the screaming stopped. Petrov's body didn't just go limp. It began to turn gray, the very color of the permafrost outside, as if every ounce of biological energy were being siphoned out. "Fall back to the elevator." Arisov shrieked, his scientific detachment replaced by a primal animal terror. "The seals won't hold it, but we have to reach the surface." The surviving soldiers scrambled toward the heavy iron lift, their boots clattering on the metallic grating. Behind them, more hatches were opening. The sleeper pods weren't just containers. They were a collective hive, and the hive was hungry after 10 millennia of starvation. Volkov was the last one in, slamming the manual lever just as a second silhouette began to manifest at the end of the corridor. As the elevator lurched upward, the Major looked down through the gaps in the floor. The entire lower deck of craft was now glowing with a sickly, rhythmic pulse. The sight was no longer a discovery. It was an infestation. The surface of Site 9 was a scene of organized chaos. The Soviet High Command, acting on Arisov's earlier frantic transmissions, had already scrambled a wing of interceptors from a nearby base at Dixon. The sky was no longer white. It was filled with the roar of jet engines and the smell of kerosene. General Zhukov, the man in charge of the regional military district, stood in the command tent, his face a mask of stone, when Volkov and Arisov burst in, covering the frost and grime of the underworld. The general didn't ask about survivors. He asked about the threat. "General, you must initiate protocol blackout." Arisov gasped, clutching the edge of a map table. "This is not a salvage operation. It is a breach. They are awakening, and they're using our own biological signatures to stabilize their forms. Every man we lose to them becomes fuel for their expansion." Zhukov looked at the radar screens. Strange blips were beginning to appear, not coming from the sky, but from beneath the earth. The seismic sensors were picking up massive displacements of rock and ice. The craft wasn't just a ship, it was a terraforming engine. "Major Volkov," the general turned his cold gaze toward the veteran. "You were down there. Tell me, can we kill them with conventional fire?" Volkov thought of the bullets vanishing into the shimmering void of the creature's chest. "Lead does nothing, General, but they reacted to the discharge. There was a flicker, a disruption in their stability. We don't need bullets, we need energy. High-intensity thermal or electromagnetic pulses. If we can't kill them, we have to burn the very air they breathe." The general nodded slowly and picked up the red telephone. This wasn't a call to Moscow. It was a call to a special unit known only as Otto 7, the Department of Unnatural Phenomena. "This is Zhukov. Activate the sun rays. Target coordinates. Site 9. Zero margin engagement." As the order was given, the ground beneath the camp began to tremble. A massive fissure opened near the excavation pit, and a pillar of violet light erupted into gray Siberian sky, punching through the clouds. The air began to vibrate with that same crushing thought from below. "We're the architects. You are the silt." The Soviet soldiers outside were paralyzed. Some fell to their knees in prayer. Others simply stared as their skin began to turn that deathly gray. The sun rays were experimental vacuum tube laser rays, massive and unstable, mounted on heavy trucks. They were designed to shoot down American bombers, but today they were being pointed at the earth. "Get to the perimeter," Volkov shouted to the men. "If those arrays fire, the atmosphere in this valley will ignite." He grabbed Dr. Arisov by the collar, dragging him toward a waiting BTR armored vehicle. As they sped away from the epicenter, Volkov looked back. The violet pillar was expanding, and within it, he could see hundreds of silhouettes rising. They weren't just creatures. They were shadows of things that existed between dimensions. The Soviet interceptors dived, unleashing salvos of rockets into the light. The explosions were muffled, swallowed by the strange physics of the pillar. Then the sun rays fired. 3 beams of concentrated, artificial light slammed into the base of the violet pillar. The sound was like the world being torn in half. A shockwave of pure heat rippled outward, vaporizing the tents, the trucks, and anyone caught in the open. The sky turned a brilliant, blinding orange as the oxygen itself burned. Volkov shielded his eyes, the heat peeling the paint off the armored car. For a moment, it seemed like the military's raw power had won. The violet light flickered and died. The ground stopped shaking. But the silence that followed was even more terrifying. As the smoke cleared, Volkov stepped out of the vehicle. The excavation pit was gone, replaced by a crater of molten glass. Nothing should have survived, but in the center of the glowing glass, standing perfectly still, was a figure. It wasn't one of the spindly entities. It was Petrov, or rather, it was the shape of Petrov. His eyes were gone, replaced by 2 glowing violet orbs, and his mouth was moving in a silent, rhythmic chant. He wasn't dead. He had been rewritten. And as he raised his hand toward the sky, the Soviet interceptors above began to fall, their engines dying in midair as if the very laws of combustion had been revoked in their presence. They aren't just here to conquer. Era saw a whisper from the shadows of the BTR. They are here to change the rules of the universe. And we just gave them the energy they needed to start. Volkov watched as the fallen jets crashed into the distant hills, their wrecks forming the first pillars of a new alien architecture. The Cold War was over. The war for soul of the planet had just begun, and the Soviet Union, along with the rest of the world, was woefully unprepared for an enemy that didn't want our land, but our very essence. We need to find the Americans, Volkov said, his voice a low growl. Zhukov, who had somehow survived inside the command bunker, emerged with a bloodied face. The Americans? They are our enemies, Major. Not anymore, Volkov replied, looking at the glowing thing that used to be his sergeant. Now we are all just prey, and the only way to survive a predator like this is to build a bigger cage. Deep in the Pentagon, thousands of miles away, a ticker tape machine began to go wild. The seismic sensors in Alaska had picked up the sunray discharge, but they had also picked up something else, a signal embedded in the tectonic shock waves that translated to a single repeating phrase in an ancient dead tongue. The harvest has begun. The shadowy figures of the U.S. Shadow Cabinet gathered in a room lit only by the glow of radar screens. They have been tracking Project Frostbite for years through spies and high-altitude U-2 flights. They knew about the craft. They knew about the violet light. And they had their own secrets buried in the sands of Nevada. Secrets that were now beginning to stir in response to the Siberian awakening. The Russians failed to contain it. A man in a dark suit remarked, his face hidden in the gloom, "Activate the Icarus protocols. If we can't stop the infection in Siberia, we will have to cauterize the entire continent." The Icarus protocols were never meant to be used. They were a theoretical nightmare, a series of scorched earth contingencies designed by a group of scientists who believed that some doors, once opened, could only be closed by burning down the house. Deep beneath the Groom Lake facility in Nevada, a place the public would one day call Area 51, the air was recycled and cold, carrying the faint metallic tang of high-voltage equipment. General Silas Vance paced the length of the war room, his footsteps echoing against the reinforced concrete. On the main monitor, a satellite image of Siberia showed a thermal anomaly so intense it looked like a literal hole had been punched in the crust of the earth. The Russians didn't just poke the beehive, Silas, Admiral Holloway remarked, leaning over a console. They invited the swarm inside. Our sensors indicate that the atmospheric composition around Site 9 is changing. The nitrogen is being converted into something heavier. If that cloud reaches the jet stream, we're looking at a global respiratory collapse within 48 hours. Vance stopped and stared at the screen. And the sleeper signals? Active, and they're communicating, Holloway replied, his voice dropping an octave. But they aren't talking to each other. They're broadcasting a localized pulse. Every piece of classified tech we recovered since the 1947 Roswell event is vibrating. It's like a tuning fork being struck in Moscow and heard in Nevada. In the lower levels of the Nevada complex, behind 6 feet of lead-lined glass, lay the United States' own dark secret, Subject Zero. It was a jagged shard of the same matte black material found in Siberia, recovered from a crash site in the desert over a decade ago. For years, it had remained inert, a mystery that defied every laser and diamond-tipped drill bit. But now it was glowing, a faint, rhythmic violet light pulsed from its core, mirroring the heartbeat of the Siberian craft. Dr. Elena Vance, the general's daughter and the lead exobiologist on the project, watched the monitors with a mixture of awe and sheer terror. "It's a beacon," she whispered to herself. The Siberian site wasn't a ship. It was a primary terminal. And this shard, this is a relay. Suddenly, the laboratory's alarms began to blare. The shard wasn't just glowing. It was melting the containment unit. The violet light intensified, and the air in the lab began to hum with that same soul-crushing frequency that had broken Major Volkov's man. Elena grabbed the intercom. "Seal level 4. Now, the shard is achieving criticality." But it was too late. The light from the shard didn't just fill the room. It seemed to rewrite the geometry of the lab. The walls appeared to stretch, the floor tilting at angles that shouldn't exist. 2 security guards stationed outside the glass suddenly collapsed, their bodies jerking as if being pulled by invisible wires. Before Elena's eyes, their skin began to take on that same ashen, gray hue. They weren't dying. They were being integrated into the signal. Back in Siberia, Major Volkov was fighting a different kind of war. The Sunray discharge had failed to destroy the entity that was once Sergeant Petrov. Instead, the entity, now a conduit for the architects, stood in the center of the molten crater, its arms outstretched. Around it, the gray, husk-like bodies of Soviet soldiers were beginning to stand up. They moved with a synchronized mechanical precision. They didn't need oxygen, and they didn't feel the sub-zero wind. They were the first legion of a new world. Volkov, Dr. Arisov, and a handful of survivors had retreated to a secondary communications bunker 5 miles from the blast zone. The walls were thick, but they could still hear the thought noise scratching at the back of their skulls. "Major, we have a window," Arisov said, frantically tuning a shortwave radio. "The Americans have been monitoring us. I've established a secure channel on the Icarus frequency. They know what's happening." Volkov took the headset. His voice was raspy, his throat burned by the ozone of the blast. "This is Major Viktor Volkov of the 12th Siberian Division. If anyone is listening, Site 9 is lost. The entity is using the sunray energy to stabilize a rift. You have to strike now, not with lasers, with everything. Use the Hephaestus option." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then a voice crackled through, cold and American. "Major, this is General Vance. We hear you, but Hephaestus means a multi-megaton atmospheric detonation. We'd be starting World War III. General," Volkov replied, looking out the bunker's narrow slit at the violet pillar growing in the distance. "If you don't start World War III, there won't be a world left to fight over. They are rewriting our biology. They are turning our soldiers into antennas. If that pillar reaches the stratosphere, they won't need ships to get here. They'll just walk through the air." In the Pentagon, Vance looked at the president's advisors. The decision was unthinkable. To drop a hydrogen bomb on Soviet territory was an act of total war. But the data from Nevada was undeniable. Subject Zero was now producing a gravitational distortion that was threatening to pull the entire facility into a pocket dimension. "The Russians are already moving their nuclear subs into position," Admiral Holloway warned. "They think we caused this. If we launch, they launch. It's the end of the line. Now if we cooperate," Vance said, his eyes narrowing. "Major Volkov, can you reach General Zhukov? We need a joint strike. Hotline agreement. We both fire at Site 9 simultaneously. We share the blame, and we share the survival." The plan was a desperate gamble. For 40 minutes, the world's 2 superpowers engaged in a frantic, secret dialogue. The red phone between Washington and Moscow hummed with more than just diplomatic tension. It carried the survival of the human race. Orders were barked in Russian and English. Silos in North Dakota and the Ural Mountains began to cycle their launch sequences. The sleeper entities, however, were not blind. They felt the shift in the planetary energy. The Petrov entity turned its gaze toward the sky, its violet eyes flashing. It didn't fear the missiles. To the architects, nuclear fission was a primitive toy, but provided exactly what they needed: a massive surge of thermal energy to tear the rift wide open. As the first ICBMs broke the atmosphere, arching toward the Siberian wasteland, the ground at Site 9 began to liquefy. The violet pillar didn't shrink. It pulsed with anticipation. Volkov stood outside the bunker, watching the streaks of light descending from the heavens. He knew that even if they destroyed the site, the world would never be the same. The secret was out. The Eldermurk was no longer a shadow in the corner of a file. It was the sky itself. "Do you think it will be enough, Doctor?" Volkov asked. Arasov didn't answer. He was staring at his own hands. The veins beneath his skin were starting to glow with a faint violet hue. He looked at Volkov. His expression won a tragic realization. It was never about the craft, Viktor. It was about the signal. And the signal is already inside us. As the horizon turned into a wall of white fire, the thought noise in Volkov's head reached a deafening crescendo. It wasn't a scream of pain. It was a laugh. The missiles struck. The world shook. And in the silence of the aftermath, a new sound began to echo across every radio frequency on Earth. A rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat that signaled the end of the Cold War and the beginning of the silent occupation. The world felt different in the wake of the strikes. The air had a metallic, ozone-heavy tang that wouldn't dissipate, and the sun, when it managed to pierce through perpetual haze of the Siberian fallout, looked pale, almost silver. Major Viktor Volkov pulled himself from the wreckage of the communication bunker. His ears were ringing with a permanent, high-pitched hum, a residual gift from the Hephaestus strike. But as he looked out over the horizon, he didn't see a wasteland. He saw a construction site. The crater where Site 9 had once been was no longer a pit of molten glass. The nuclear fire had been absorbed, channeled into the earth like water into a sponge. Emerging from the center of the blast zone were monolithic structures made of that same matte black substance, rising like the ribs of some gargantuan, subterranean beast. They were miles high, piercing the clouds, and they were vibrating. The sun rays and the hydrogen bombs hadn't destroyed the architects. They had provided the raw caloric energy required for the entities to manifest their physical infrastructure. "We didn't kill it," a voice rasped. Volkov turned to see Dr. Arasov. The scientist's transformation had slowed, but it hadn't stopped. The violet veins in his neck were now thick and pulsing, and his eyes had a strange, iridescent sheen. He wasn't shivering, despite the sub-zero temperatures. "We gave them the keys to the kingdom. Viktor, we thought in terms of destruction. They think in terms of conversion." Volkov reached for his sidearm, but his holster was empty. It didn't matter. Even a battalion of tanks would be useless against what was happening. Around them, the gray men, the converted Soviet soldiers, were no longer wandering aimlessly. They were working. With terrifying, silent efficiency, they were dismantling the remains of the military base, stripping the metal and dragging it toward the black monoliths. They didn't speak. They didn't eat. They were simply extensions of the signal. "We have to move," Volkov said, his voice cracking. "The Americans, General Vance, they need to know that the strike failed." "They already know," Arasov said, pointing toward the sky. High above, far beyond the reach of any interceptor, faint streaks of violet light were etching themselves across the stars. These weren't missiles. They were threads, strands of pure information being woven into the planet's magnetosphere. The architects were rewriting the world's operating system. In Washington, D.C., the situation was even more dire. The Icarus protocols had been triggered, but the shadow government was finding that their own shadows were betraying them. Inside the Pentagon's Securus vault, the black box containing the records of every extraterrestrial encounter since the 1930s was melting, not from heat, but from the sheer weight of the data being beamed from Siberia. General Silas Vance stood in the center of the war room, watching as the staff began to change. It started with a twitch, a rhythmic tapping of fingers on consoles. Then, the humming. One by one, The officers began to chant a series of coordinates in a language that sounded like grinding stone. "Step away from the consoles." Vance screamed, drawing his service weapon. "That's an order." His top aide, Colonel Miller, turned slowly. His face was a mask of terrifying serenity. "The general is confused," Miller said, his voice echoing with strange, double-tone resonance. "There is no order anymore, Silas. There is only the frequency. We are being tuned. Don't you feel it? The static in your head. It's not noise. It's a song." Vance didn't hesitate. He fired a single shot. The bullet struck Miller in the chest, but there was no blood. Instead, a puff of fine, gray ash erupted from the wound. Miller didn't fall. He simply looked down at the hole in his uniform and smiled. "The vessel is irrelevant. The message has been delivered." Vance backed away, his heart hammering against his ribs. He realized then that the silent occupation wasn't an invasion of ships. It was an invasion of the mind. Every radio broadcast, every television signal, every hum of the power grid had been co-opted. The architects weren't coming from space. They were emerging from the very technology humanity had built to connect itself. He scrambled to the emergency exit, heading for the underground rail that led to the Raven Rock bunker. He needed to find his daughter, Elena. If the shard in Nevada was a relay, she was at the epicenter of the psychic storm. Back at the Groom Lake facility, Elena Vance was witnessing the birth of a new physics. The lab had been completely overtaken by the violet light. The shard, Subject Zero, had expanded into a doorway. It wasn't a hole in space, but a fold in time. She could see through it, glimpsing a world that was both ancient and futuristic. A sprawling city of black glass under a dying violet sun. The security guards who had been converted were standing around the doorway, their hands joined. They weren't guarding it. They were stabilizing it. Elena, she turned to see a figure stepping through the doorway. It looked like a man, but its skin was translucent, revealing a skeleton made of glowing fiber optics. It didn't speak with its mouth, but its thoughts flooded her mind like a tidal wave. "You were the planners," the entity thought. "You tilled the soil of this reality with your wars and your radios. You created the noise we needed to find our way back. Now, the harvest is mature. What do you want from us?" Elena whispered, her nose beginning to bleed. "We want nothing from you. We want the space you occupy. We are the architects of the Eldermurk. We do not destroy. We repurpose." Outside the facility, the desert was no longer silent. The sand was beginning to vibrate, rising in rhythmic waves. Beneath the dunes, something massive was stirring. Similar reports were coming in from all over the globe. The pyramids of Giza were humming. The deep trenches of the Pacific were boiling. The ruins of Stonehenge were glowing with violet hue. The ancient sites weren't monuments. They were dormant nodes, and the Siberian strike had been the start button. Volkov and Arisov, now trekking through Siberian night toward a hidden Otto 7 outpost, saw the first of the harvesters descend. They weren't ships, but giant, jellyfish-like structures made of solidified light. They drifted through the air, trailing long, glowing filaments that brushed against the ground. Wherever the filaments touched, the world changed. Trees turned to glass, rock turned to liquid, and humans were gathered like wheat. "They are reclaiming the garden," Arisov muttered, his voice becoming more alien by the minute. The Cold War was just a distraction. We were fighting over borders while the landlord was coming up the driveway. Volkov looked at his hands. The gray hue was starting to creep up his fingers. He had been exposed too long. He felt the fear leaving him, replaced by a cold mathematical peace. The thought noise was becoming a beautiful symphony. He knew that soon he wouldn't be Viktor Volkov anymore. He would be a part of the architecture. But there was a spark of the old soldier left in him, a stubborn, human refusal to surrender without a fight. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small manual detonator connected to a series of charges he had planted in the Otto 7 outpost fuel reserves. It wasn't a nuclear strike. It wasn't a sun ray. It was just old-fashioned chemical fire. "Not today," Volkov whispered, his eyes flashing with final, human defiance. "If we are the silt, then we will be the grit that jams your machine." He pressed the button. The explosion was small compared to the nuclear fire of the morning, but it was enough to sever the local thread for a split second. In that moment of static, the mental grip of the architects wavered. Across the globe, for one heartbeat, people woke up. They saw the gray skin, they saw the violet sky, and they screamed. It was a scream that echoed from the bunkers of Nevada to the streets of Moscow, a collective cry of a species realizing its own extinction. And in the darkness of the Eldermurk, the architects paused. They hadn't expected the silt to bite back. The momentary lapse in the frequency was like a breath of oxygen to a drowning man. Across the shattered landscapes of the northern hemisphere, the grip of the architects slipped just long enough for survivors to realize they were no longer alone in their own heads. In the burning ruins of the Otto 7 outpost, Major Viktor Volkov stood amidst the black smoke of the fuel explosion. The gray tint on his skin hadn't vanished, but the rhythmic pulsing in his veins had dimmed. For the first time in hours, he could think a thought that wasn't a geometric calculation. "Arisov," he barked, coughing through the fumes. The doctor was slumped against a charred Euro truck, his eyes darting wildly. The violet iridescence in his pupils was flickering like a dying light bulb. It felt like a disconnect, Viktor. The explosion created a localized electromagnetic void. The signal couldn't bridge the gap of the chemical heat. Arisov wiped a thick, dark fluid from his nose. "We can't fight them with their own energy. We have to use the primitive, the raw, the chaotic." But the architects were quick to calibrate. Above them, the giant, jellyfish-like harvesters began to descend lower, their filaments glowing with an angry, staccato red. The symphony was being replaced by a dirge. The mental pressure returned, heavier than before, like an iron shroud being draped over the world. "They're tightening the net," Volkov said, grabbing a mechanical compass from his belt. The needle was spinning in frantic, meaningless circles. "We need to find the dead zones, areas with no radio towers, no power lines, no connection to the modern world. If the signal travels through our technology, we have to go where the technology isn't." Meanwhile, in the depths of the Raven Rock Mountain complex, General Silas Vance had reached the Black Room. This was a bunker within a bunker, shielded by layers of lead, copper, and salt, a relic of early Cold War paranoia designed to withstand a direct psychic or electromagnetic assault. Inside were three men, members of the majestic 12 Oversight Committee, their faces etched with the fatigue of 1,000 secrets. "The surface is gone, Silas," one of them said, his voice flat. "Our satellites are no longer transmitting images of Earth. They are transmitting images of something else, a geometric lattice that is slowly replacing the atmosphere. We call it the crystalline shroud." Vance slammed his fist onto the table. "I don't care what you call it. My daughter is still at Groom Lake, and the Russians have a major out in the tundra who figured out how to jam their signal with a bucket of gasoline. We are not dead yet." "Groom Lake is the heart of the infection now," the Admiral replied. "The shard has opened a permanent gate. It's not just a signal anymore. They are physically manifesting. We've lost contact with every major city. London, Paris, Tokyo, they didn't even fire a shot. They just stopped responding. The people there aren't dead, Silas. They're being retasked. They're building towers, and those towers are amplifying the shroud." Vance looked at a manual map of the United States. He traced a line toward the Appalachian Mountains. "There are regions here, valleys so deep and remote that the signal hasn't fully saturated them. We call them the Gray Ridges. If we can gather enough untuned survivors, we might be able to strike at the nodes." "Strike with what?" the Admiral asked. "Our missiles were absorbed. Our lasers were their fuel." "With the God-Killer Project," Vance whispered. The room went silent. God-Killer was a weapon born from the darkest fringes of the Cold War, a device that used concentrated sound frequencies to shatter molecular bonds. It was primitive, loud, and incredibly dangerous. It didn't rely on the frequency of the architects. It was the ultimate disharmony. Back in Siberia, Volkov and Arisov were no longer walking. They were hunting. They had found a small village that had been bypassed by the first wave of the shroud. The villagers were terrified, huddled in a stone church, clutching old icons. To them, this was the apocalypse. To Volkov, it was a tactical advantage. The church is built on a bed of natural quartz, Arisov noted, examining the ground. It's a natural insulator. The architect's signal is being refracted. That's why these people are still human. Suddenly, the air outside the church grew cold, colder than the Siberian night should be. The sound of rhythmic tapping began to echo against the stone walls. Tap, tap, tap. It was the gray men. The converted soldiers had found them. They didn't use guns. They didn't need them. They carried long, obsidian-like rods that hummed with a violet light. They found the gap in the net, Volkov said, drawing a heavy combat knife. Doctor, get behind the altar. If I don't make it, you have to get the coordinates of the dead zones to the Americans. Use the old telegraph lines. They still work. The heavy wooden doors of the church groaned and then shattered inward, not from a kick, but from a focused burst of sonic pressure. The first of the gray men stepped into the flickering candlelight. It was a thing that used to be Sergeant Petrov. His movements were jerky, like a marionette being controlled by an amateur, but his power was undeniable. The air around him distorted, blurring the icons on the walls. Viktor, Petrov's voice was a chorus of 1,000 whispers. Why do you resist the harmony? The struggle is a relic of your biology. The architects offer a world without friction, a world without end. I like my friction, Sergeant, Volkov growled. He kicked over a barrel of ritual oil and threw a lit torch into the pool. The fire roared to life, and for a second, the violet glow in Petrov's eyes wavered. The chaos of the flames, the unpredictable flickering of light and heat, was anathema to the architect's perfect order. Volkov lunged, not for the heart, but for the obsidian rod. He knew that the rod was the antenna, the link between the man and the shroud. The struggle was brutal. Petrov's strength was supernatural, his skin feeling like cold marble. But Volkov was a man who had survived the siege of Stalingrad. He knew that even gods could be bled if you found the right angle. He slammed his knife into the joint of the obsidian rod, twisting with every ounce of his remaining strength. The rod cracked. A screeching, electronic wail filled the church, loud enough to shatter the stained glass windows. Petrov collapsed, his body dissolving into that fine, gray ash. The other converted soldiers outside froze, their connection severed. The chaos, Arisov whispered, crawling out from his hiding place. It's the only way. Their technology is built on perfect, predictable patterns. If we introduce enough variables, enough noise, the system crashes. Volkov stood over the ash of his friend, his breathing heavy. He looked at the sky through the broken roof. The violet shroud was still there, but it felt thinner. We need more noise, Volkov said. We need to turn the whole world into a riot. In Nevada, Elena Vance was thinking the same thing. Inside the Groom Lake facility, she had managed to hide in a ventilation shaft, watching as the entities began to construct a great coil around the gate. She realized that the gate wasn't just bringing things in. It was drawing the Earth's core energy out. She pulled a small, portable radio from her bag, a gift from her father. She began to tune the dial, looking for any sign of a human voice. All she heard was the rhythmic heartbeat of the architects. But then she stopped. Underneath the heartbeat, there was a faint, scratching sound. It was Morse code. The Major was still alive, and he was broadcasting from the end of the world. Elena's eyes sharpened. She didn't have a weapon, but she had the facility's manual override for the cooling system. If she could cause a localized meltdown, the resulting steam and pressure would create a massive, noisy event, a distraction large enough for her father's God-Killer project to find its mark. The harvest isn't over yet, she whispered, her fingers dancing over the manual valves. We're just getting started. The silence in the ventilation shafts of Groom Lake was not a true silence. It was a heavy, pressurized hum that felt like it was trying to push Elena Vance's eyeballs out of their sockets. Below her, the great coil was nearing completion. The architects moved with a terrifying grace, their translucent bodies shimmering as they wove together strands of raw energy and physical matter. They were no longer just shadows. They were the new masters of the American desert. Elena knew that if she didn't act now, the gate would stabilize, and the Earth would be nothing more than a hollowed-out shell for an empire that spanned dimensions. She reached for the manual override valves. There was no computer interface here, no digital screen that the architects could hijack with their frequency. It was old, rusted iron and hydraulic pressure. She began to turn the first wheel. It groaned, a sharp metallic scream that echoed through the shaft. Below, the entities paused, their non-existent heads tilted in unison toward the ceiling. They were sensitive to vibration, and Elena had just struck a chord of pure discord. "Come and get me, you bastards," she whispered, putting her entire weight into the second valve. With a thunderous crack, the high-pressure steam lines ruptured. A wall of white vapor exploded into the laboratory, obscuring the violet light and throwing the architect's sensors into a frenzy. The perfect geometry of the room was suddenly shattered by the chaotic turbulence of the steam. The entities flickered, their forms becoming unstable as the thermal chaos disrupted their connection to the shroud. This was the noise Volkov had spoken of. This was the grit in the machine. Thousands of miles away, in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, General Silas Vance heard the signal. It wasn't Morse code, and it wasn't a radio broadcast. It was a seismic tremor, a rhythmic pulsing of the earth that his sensors identified as the emergency purge sequence from Groom Lake. His daughter had done her part. "Target confirmed," the general said, his voice cold and steady. "The gate in Nevada is flickering. Its shielding is down. Activate the God Killer." The God Killer was not a missile. It was a massive subterranean acoustic array, hidden deep within a mountain peak. As the technicians threw the final switches, a low-frequency vibration began to build. It wasn't a sound you could hear with your ears. It was a sound you felt in your teeth, in your lungs, in the very structure of your DNA. It was a jagged, discordant wave designed to counteract the harmony of the architects. As the wave surged outward, it traveled to the bedrock of the continent. In the cities, the gray men began to collapse. The towers they were building started to develop hairline fractures, the matte black material vibrating until it turned back into dust. The shroud in the sky began to tear, revealing patches of the natural, dark blue night for the first time in days. Back in Siberia, Volkov and Arisov saw the change. The violet pillar at sight, 9, was no longer a steady beam of light. It was flickering, jumping like a candle in a gale. "The Americans have fired!" Arisov shouted over the roar of the wind. "The frequency is breaking. Viktor, look at the harvesters." High above the tundra, the jellyfish-like structures were folding in on themselves. Their filaments, once so predatory and precise, were now lashing out wildly, incinerating the very ground they'd been trying to reclaim. The architects were losing their grip on the local reality. The chaos Elena had triggered in Nevada was cascading across the entire global network. "We can't just watch," Volkov said, his eyes fixed on the distant crater of Site 9. "If the shroud is tearing, that means the primary node is vulnerable. We have to finish what the nuclear strike couldn't." He turned to the survivors in the church. They were no longer cowering. They saw the violet light fading, and the human spirit, that stubborn, irrational thing, was beginning to ignite. They grabbed whatever they could: iron bars, old rifles, bottles of fuel. They didn't have high-tech weapons, but they had the one thing the architects couldn't calculate: desperation. Volkov led the charge back toward the epicenter. As they moved across the wasteland, they saw the remains of the Soviet 12th Division. Some were still gray husks, frozen in place, but others were beginning to blink, their eyes clearing as the mental fog lifted. Soldiers of the Union. Volkov's voice carried through the freezing air like a whip. "The enemy is in your heads. Drive them out. To the pit. To the pit." The battle for Site 9 was a chaotic, bloody mess. On one side was a legion of transcended, hyper-intelligent entities from another dimension. On the other was a mob of freezing, starving, and terrified human beings. By all laws of logic, the humans should have been wiped out in seconds, but the God-Killer frequency was still pounding through the earth, making it impossible for the architects to coordinate their defenses. Volkov reached the edge of the crater. The Petrov entity was there, trying to stabilize the pillar with its bare hands. Its skin was translucent, showing the flickering light of a dying star within its chest. It looked at Volkov, and for a brief second, the Major saw a glimpse of his old friend in those violet eyes, a silent plea for an end. Volkov didn't hesitate. He didn't use a gun. He used a heavy manual demolition charge, the kind used to clear mines in the Great War. He dived into the crater, the heat of the molten glass searing his boots, and slammed the charge directly into the base of the flickering pillar. This is for the garden. Volkov screamed. The explosion wasn't just chemical. It was a focal point of human intent. As the blast went off, it intersected with the God-killer wave coming from the west. The two forces, the physical and the acoustic, slammed into the violet pillar at the same time. The sky over Siberia didn't just turn orange, it turned white. A shockwave of pure, unadulterated reality rippled outward, dissolving the black monoliths and shattering the remaining harvesters into a million shards of harmless glass. The violet light was sucked back into the earth, disappearing into the depths of sight, nine with a sound like a retreating tide. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Volkov lay on the ground, his body broken, his skin finally returning to its natural weathered color. He looked up at the stars. They were the stars he remembered. No violet threads, no geometric lattices, just the cold, indifferent beauty of the cosmos. Beside him, Arisov crawled to the edge of the pit. He looked down into the darkness. It's gone, Viktor. The gate is closed. The connection is severed. Is it? Volkov asked, his voice a whisper. Or did we just buy ourselves a little more time? In Nevada, the Groom Lake facility was a tomb. Elena Vance emerged from the ruins, her clothes torn and her face blackened by soot. She looked out at the desert. The great coil was a pile of twisted metal. The entities were gone, vanished into the air like smoke. But as she looked at the horizon, she saw a faint, silver shimmer, a lingering ghost of the shroud. In the Pentagon, General Vance sat in the dark. The God-killer array had burned itself out, the mountain peak having literally melted from the intensity of the frequency. The world was safe, but the cost was immeasurable. The global infrastructure was in ruins. The secret was no longer a secret. Billions of people had felt the mind of the architect, and they would never forget the feeling of being prey. He picked up a file on his desk. It was a new dossier, started only minutes ago. On the cover, in bold black letters, were the words, "The Silent Occupation, Phase 2. They didn't leave because we won," Vance muttered to the empty room. "They left because the environment became too noisy to harvest. They'll wait. They'll wait for us to get quiet again. They'll wait for us to rebuild our radios and our satellites. And next time, they won't use a frequency we can hear." Outside, the wind began to howl again, carrying the faint, rhythmic tapping of a sound that shouldn't exist. The war for the Eldermurk had not ended. It had simply gone back into the shadows, waiting for the next time humanity dared to look too deep into the ice. The aftermath of the Great Disruption felt like a world waking up from a fever dream, only to find the bedroom walls had been painted with the blood of their secrets. Throughout the winter of 1963, the planet remained in a state of fractured paralysis. The violet shroud had vanished, but it left behind a world that no longer trusted its own senses. Major Viktor Volkov sat in a sterile, windowless room deep beneath Moscow, the hum of the ventilation system, the only sound in his universe. His hands, once steady enough to dismantle a live mine in a blizzard, now had a permanent, microscopic tremor. He wasn't being treated as a hero. In the eyes of the new Soviet leadership, he was a witness to a failure that officially never happened. "They are calling the great atmospheric anomaly, Viktor," Dr. Arisov said, sitting across from him. The doctor looked aged, his skin like yellow parchment, though the violet veins had finally faded into faint, silver scars. The official reports speak of solar flares and experimental high-altitude tests. The people who saw the gray men are being told they suffer from mass hysteria caused by chemical leaks. The truth is being buried under 10 tons of Soviet ink. Volkov looked up, his eyes cold. "You can't bury what's inside people's heads, doctor." Every soldier who was at site, 9 remembers a song. Every mother who saw her child turn gray in the streets of Kiev is waiting for the other shoe to drop. We didn't win a war. We just broke the radio. Arasov leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The Americans are doing the same. General Vance has gone underground. My contacts say the Pentagon is being purged of anyone who felt the frequency too deeply. They call it the cleansing, but there is a group, Viktor, a group that spans both sides of the Iron Curtain. They call themselves the Sentinels of the Murk. They know that the architects didn't retreat to the stars. They retreated into the white noise of our world. In the United States, the silence was being put to strategic use. The ruins of the Groom Lake facility had been encased in a massive concrete sarcophagus, much like the one that would later cover Chernobyl. Elena Vance was no longer a free woman. She was a property of the state, kept in a luxurious but high-security bunker in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Her father, the general, visited her only once every month, and they spoke through a thick pane of lead-lined glass. "They are rebuilding the network, Dad," Elena said during one of their brief meetings. She looked thin, but her eyes were sharper than ever. The new satellite programs, the undersea cables, it's all happening again. The politicians think they can control it this time. They think they can use the architect's technology to win the Cold War once and for all. General Silas Vance stared at his daughter, his heart heavy with a guilt that had no name. The president believes we have decoded the encryption. He believes we can build a firewall that the architects can't penetrate. We're calling it the Iron Aegis. It's a global defense grid. Elena, a way to lock the door from the inside. "You aren't locking a door, Dad," Elena replied, her voice trembling with frustration. "You're building a bigger antenna. The architects don't need a door. They are the wood the door is made of. They are the air in the room. Every time we use their logic to build our defenses, we are just giving them more territory to occupy. The only way to stay safe is to go dark, truly dark." But the world was not going dark. It was getting louder. The 1960s were becoming a decade of unprecedented technological explosion. Television sets were in every home. Radio towers were blooming across the globe like steel weeds. To the average citizen, it was the age of progress. To the few who knew the truth, it was the setup for a second harvest. In Siberia, the earth began to groan again. Not at Site 9, which was now a forbidden zone guarded by elite Spetsnaz units, but in the remote corners of the world where no one was looking, deep in the Himalayan peaks, and at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, the rhythmic tapping had returned. Tap, tap, tap. It was a heartbeat, slow and patient. The architects were no longer trying to force their way in through a massive gate. They were using a more subtle method. Infiltration through the very progress humanity craved. Volkov was finally released from his confinement in late 1964. He was given a new identity and sent to work as a lowly clerk in a weather station near the Mongolian border. It was a calculated move by the KGB to keep him isolated, but they had made a mistake. A weather station was the perfect place to listen to the world. Working late into the night, Volkov began to notice a pattern in the atmospheric pressure readings. Every Tuesday, at exactly 3 in the morning, the barometer would drop to a level that was physically impossible, only to return to normal seconds later. He began to cross-reference these drops with shortwave radio static he picked up on his personal kit. It wasn't a song this time. It was a countdown. "They're back!" Volkov muttered to himself, the cold Siberian wind rattling the windows of his shack. He reached under his floorboards and pulled out a small, battered notebook. In it were the names of the survivors from the church, and the secret frequencies Arasov had given him. He began to tap out a message on an old, manual telegraph key, a device so primitive that it produced no electronic signature for the architects to track. "The wind is turning cold. The harvester has a new sickle. Contact the American." Weeks later, a response arrived. It wasn't a telegram or a radio call. It was a package delivered by a nomadic herder, containing a single rusted skeleton key and a map of a small town in West Virginia called Point Pleasant. Inside the box was a note written in a hand that Volkov recognized from the classified files of the Pentagon. "The Icarus has fallen, but the Phoenix is blind. Meet US at the TNT area. The birds are watching." Volkov knew that leaving his post meant death if he was caught. He was a man with no country, a ghost of a war that had been erased from history. But as he looked out at the vast, dark horizon, he saw a flicker of violet light in the clouds. Just a spark, gone in an instant. It was enough. The silent occupation had entered its second phase. The era of the sleeper agents had begun. The architects were no longer looking for soldiers. They were looking for hosts. They were in the boardrooms, in the laboratories, and in the dreams of the men who held the nuclear keys. As Volkov began his long journey toward the west, he realized the terrifying brilliance of the enemy's new strategy. To defeat the architects, humanity had to stop being human. We had to abandon our machines, our music, and our connection to one another. We had to become as cold and silent as the ice they had been buried in for 10,000 years. But even as he felt the weight of the task, a new thought entered his mind. A thought that didn't feel like his own, yet didn't feel like the architect's either. It was a low, resonant hum of ancient Earth, a reminder that the planet itself had a memory, and it did not like being rewritten. The war for the Eldermurk was moving into the shadows of the Cold War's peak. The year was 1966, and in the hills of West Virginia, a new kind of entity was being sighted. A creature with red eyes and wings of shadow, a harbinger of the next breach. The world called it the Mothman. Volkov called it an early warning system. The chess pieces were being set for a game that would decide the fate of the next century. On one side stood the architects and their human puppets. On the other, a broken major, a captive scientist, and a general who had lost his soul to save his world. The Eldermurk was expanding, and this time, there would be no white fire to save us. The TNT area near Point Pleasant was a sprawling labyrinth of abandoned World War II explosive bunkers, overgrown with thick brush and buried under decades of industrial rot. It was the perfect place for ghosts to gather. Viktor Volkov moved through the shadows of the concrete domes, his hand resting on the hilt of a hunting knife. He no longer carried a Soviet uniform, but the way he moved, silent, low, and constantly scanning the tree line, betrayed his years in the Otto 7 units. "You're late, Major," a voice echoed from the darkness of Bunker 13. Volkov froze. He recognized the cadence. It was General Silas Vance, but the voice was hollowed out, stripped of the booming authority it once held in the Pentagon's war room. As Vance stepped into the moonlight, Volkov saw a man who had been consumed by his own secrets. His hair was stark white, and his eyes were sunken into a face that looked like it had been carved from gray stone. "Getting out of the Union isn't as easy as it used to be, General," Volkov replied, his English accented but sharp, especially when the border guards have eyes that glow in the dark. Vance nodded grimly. He gestured for Volkov to enter the bunker. Inside, the air smelled of damp earth and old chemical residue. A single kerosene lamp flickered on a wooden crate, casting long, distorted shadows against the curved walls. Sitting on a folding chair was a woman Volkov had only seen in grainy surveillance photos, Elena Vance. Beside her, huddled in a heavy overcoat, was Dr. Arisov. The team was back together, but they were no longer an army. They were a cell. "We don't have much time," Elena said, her voice urgent. She was staring at a portable frequency analyzer that was spitting out jagged, irregular lines. The local anomaly is peaking. The townspeople call it the Mothman, but it's not a creature, Viktor. It's a bleed-through. The architects are trying to anchor a new kind of node here, but the geology is wrong. The ground is too unstable, too full of old iron and sulfur. It's creating a sensory glitch. "A glitch we can use," Vance added. He unfolded a map of the Silver Bridge, which spanned the Ohio River. The architects have moved away from the massive pillars. They are going for the infrastructure of the mind. They realize that if they can collapse a major point of human connection, a bridge, a communications hub, a center of commerce, the resulting mass trauma creates a spike in the local frequency. That spike is what they use to harvest the collective consciousness of a population. Volkov looked at the map. "You think they're going to drop the bridge?" "They aren't going to drop it," Arisov intervened, his voice trembling. "They are going to tune it. They've been seeing Viktor." The red eyes the locals report. "Those aren't eyes. They are bioluminescent sensors." The architects are mapping the structural integrity of the bridge, an emotional state of everyone who crosses it. On the day of the collapse, they won't just take lives. They will take the essence of everyone caught in the fall. The strategy had shifted from a military invasion to an occult harvest. The architects had learned that the human soul was most vulnerable during moments of sudden, overwhelming terror. By orchestrating disasters, they could feed the shroud without alerting the global population to their presence. It was the ultimate silent occupation. Suddenly, a high-pitched screech tore through the night, coming from the top of the bunker. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was the sound of metal being sheared by a frequency. The analyzer in Elena's lap went haywire, the screen glowing a violent, toxic purple. "They're here," she whispered. Volkov reached for the lamp and blew it out. The bunker was plunged into darkness, save for two glowing red orbs that appeared at the ventilation slit near the ceiling. The orbs didn't blink. They vibrated. Volkov felt the old, familiar pressure in his skull. The song was trying to find a way back in, but this time, he was ready. He pulled a small lead-lined box from his coat. Inside was a shard of the God Killer array, a piece of the acoustic crystal that had survived a meltdown in the Appalachians. "Cover your ears," Volkov shouted. He slammed a small hammer against the crystal. The resulting sound was a dissonant, bone-shaking chime that seemed to rip through the air itself. The red orbs outside flared and then vanished with a wet, flapping sound. The pressure in their heads evaporated instantly. "It's a temporary fix," Vance said, his breathing heavy. "The more we use the crystal, the more it draws them to us. We are like a flare in a dark ocean. We need to stop the tuning at the bridge before the harvest begins." "How?" Volkov asked. "We are 4 people against a force that can rewrite physics." "We don't rewrite physics," Elena said, looking at the bridge coordinates. "We use their own logic against them. They need the bridge to be a perfect conductor for the trauma. If we introduce a chaos variable, something they haven't accounted for in their mapping, the bridge won't become an anchor. It will just be a tragedy. A terrible human tragedy, but one they can't feed on." Volkov understood the grim mathematics. They couldn't save the bridge. The architects had already compromised its structure, but they could prevent the harvest. They could ensure that the souls of the victims remained out of reach of the shroud. "The date is set," Vance said, his voice cracking. "December 1967. We have 1 year to build the jammers. We have to place them in the foundations of the bridge without the men in black catching us." "The men in black?" Volkov asked. "The architect's new front line," Arisov said, shivering. "Human-looking shells, dressed in dark suits, driving cars that leave no tracks. They are the ones cleaning up the evidence. They're the ones making sure the world keeps believing in solar flares and mass hysteria." As the small group gathered their gear to leave the bunker, Volkov looked back at the rusted iron door. He thought of the thousands of people in Point Pleasant, going about their lives, unaware that they were being measured like cattle for slaughter they wouldn't even realize were happening. The Cold War was no longer about communism or capitalism. It was a war for the right to die a human death. As they stepped out into the foggy West Virginia night, a large, dark shape took flight from a nearby tree, its wingspan eclipsing the moon. "Let it watch," Volkov muttered, gripping his knife. "We aren't the same prey we were in Siberia." The countdown to the Silver Bridge had begun, and in the shadows of the Eldermurk, the architects began to realize that the grit in their machine was starting to organize. The silent occupation was about to meet the silent resistance. The winter of 1967 was abnormally cold, a damp chill that seemed to seep through skin and settle directly into the bone. In the small town of Point Pleasant, life appeared normal to the casual observer, but underneath the surface, the frequency was screaming. Viktor Volkov spent his days working as a transient laborer near the docks, his eyes always fixed on the Silver Bridge. To the locals, it was a vital artery of steel and rivets. To Volkov, it was a giant tuning fork, vibrating with a low-level hum that only those who had survived Site 9 could hear. "The resonance is almost at the breaking point," Dr. Arisov whispered, huddled in the back seat of a rusted Chevrolet parked near the riverbank. He was monitoring a device hidden inside a lunchbox, a modified receiver that tracked the non-human vibrations of the bridge's suspension chains. "The architects aren't just weakening the steel, Victor. They are aligning the molecular structure of the entire bridge to act as a conductor. When it snaps, it won't just be a structural failure. It will be a psychic discharge. Volkov watched the black Cadillac cruise slowly down the main street. The windows were tinted dark, reflecting the gray sky. These men in black Vance had warned him about. They weren't agents of any government. They were biological shells, empty vessels inhabited by the architect's signal. They moved through the town with a stiff, unnatural precision, visiting anyone who had reported seeing the Mothman and leaving them confused, terrified, or silent. "We have to place the jammers tonight," Volkov said, checking his heavy coat. Inside the lining were 4 small, lead-shielded cylinders. They were the noise makers, primitive high-frequency oscillators designed to disrupt the perfect harmony the architects needed for the harvest. If we wait until the traffic peaks for the Christmas rush, the interference will be too late. That night, under a moonless sky, Volkov and General Vance met beneath the massive stone piers of the bridge. The river was a dark, churning mass of ice and silt. Above them, the bridge groaned under the weight of the evening traffic. The sound of tires on metal grating like rhythmic chanting. "My daughter is monitoring the shroud levels from the safe house," Vance said, his voice a low rasp. He handed Volkov a climbing harness. "She says the red-eyed entities are gathering on the upper cables. They are waiting for the sink. Once the bridge reaches the critical vibration, they will trigger the collapse and open the localized rift." Volkov began to climb. The steel was slick with frost, and the wind whipped around the piers with a predatory howl. As he reached the first suspension joint, he saw it, a creature perched on the cable above him. It didn't have wings in the biological sense. It had folds of shimmering, dark matter that defied the wind. Its eyes were 2 burning pits of crimson light. Pulsing in time with the hum of the bridge, the creature didn't attack. It watched. It was a surveyor, the one ensuring the alignment was perfect. Volkov felt the song trying to pierce his mind, a cold, sweet melody that promised an end to the fear and the cold. He bit his tongue until he tasted blood, the sharp pain grounding him in his own body. He reached into his coat, pulled out the first jammer, and wedged it into the gap between the main eye bar and the pin. He clicked the switch. A jagged, discordant vibration rippled through the steel. It wasn't loud, but to the surveyor, it must have sounded like a scream. The red-eyed entity let out a screech that vibrated in Volkov's very teeth, and it took flight, its shadow momentarily blotting out the stars. One down. Volkov grunted, moving toward the second pier. But the architects were not blind. Across the river, the black Cadillac pulled onto the bridge, stopping abruptly in the middle of the span. 3 men in dark suits stepped out. They didn't look at the traffic. They looked down at the water, their heads tilting in unison. They raised their hands, and the air around the bridge began to shimmer with a violet hue. "Viktor, get down." Vance's voice came over the small, handheld radio. A pulse of pure kinetic energy slammed into the bridge. The steel screamed as the internal tension was suddenly doubled. Volkov clung to the cable, the vibrations nearly shaking his heart out of his chest. He saw the second jammer fly from his hand, tumbling into the dark waters of the Ohio River below. The men in black are accelerating the timeline. Elena's voice broke through the radio static. "The rift is opening early. Dad, the bridge can't hold the surge." It was December 15th, 1967. The bridge was packed with cars, people coming home from work, families heading to shops, lives entwined in the mundane routines of a winter evening. Below, Volkov scrambled to the third position. He had only 2 jammers left. If he couldn't disrupt the harvest, the souls of everyone on that bridge would be pulled into the Eldermurk. "General, draw their fire," Volkov shouted into the radio. Vance didn't hesitate. He stepped out from the shadows of the pier and began firing his service pistol at the men in suits on the bridge deck. The bullet struck the Cadillac, sparks flying, drawing the attention of the biological shells. The men in black turned toward the general, their faces devoid of emotion. They began to walk toward him, the ground beneath their feet cracking as they projected a crushing gravitational field. Volkov used the distraction to reach the final critical junction. He slammed the remaining 2 jammers into the steel and activated them simultaneously. The bridge began to shake violently, not with the architect harmony, but with a chaotic, violent shudder. The violet shimmer in the air began to fracture, turning into a messy, flickering gray. The rift is collapsing. Elena screamed, but the bridge is going with it. Volkov looked up. The main eye bar, weakened by the architect's tuning and the jammer's discord, finally snapped. The sound was like a cannon shot echoing across the valley. Then came the terrifying sound of rending metal. The silver bridge began to fold into the river. Volkov leaped from the pier just as the massive structure gave way. He hit the icy water with a force that knocked the air from his lungs, the darkness of the river swallowing him whole. Above him, cars plunged into the depths, the headlights cutting through the murky water like dying stars. In the chaos, something happened that the architects hadn't planned for. Because of Volkov's jammers, the harvest failed. The souls of the victims didn't ascend into the shroud. They remained with the earth. The rift, starved of the psychic energy it needed to stabilize, imploded. The red-eyed entities vanished into the night. Their screeches of frustration lost in the roar of the collapsing steel. Volkov surfaced several hundred yards downstream, his body numb, his lungs burning. He dragged himself onto the muddy bank, looking back at the wreckage. The silver bridge was gone. People were screaming in the dark, and the town of Point Pleasant was plunged into a grief that would last for generations. He felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Arisov, his face streaked with tears. We saved them, Viktor. We saved their essence. But at what cost? Volkov looked at the empty space where the bridge had been. The cost is a truth, Doctor. To the world, this is a tragedy of engineering. To us, it's a victory of shadows. And the architects, they won't forgive us for this one. In the distance, the black Cadillac sat on the edge of the riverbank, its engine idling silently. The men in black watched the survivors for a long moment before turning the car around and disappearing into the fog. The silent resistance had won a battle, but they had revealed their hand. The year 1967 ended not with a bang, but with a cold, terrifying realization. The Eldermurk was no longer just watching. It was mourning its lost harvest, and a mourning god is a vengeful one. As Volkov walked away from the river, he didn't look back. He knew that the next phase of the war would take them deeper into the darkness, into the era of the 1970s, where the secrets would move from the bridges to the very stars themselves. By 1972, the world had moved on from the anomalies of the previous decade. The Cold War had entered a period of détente, a deceptive calm that masked a frantic, secret arms race, not for nuclear superiority, but for the mastery of the deep signal. Major Viktor Volkov, now operating under the alias of a Czech electrical engineer, lived in a cramped apartment in West Berlin, a city that was itself a scar on the face of the planet. He was a man out of time, his body scarred by Siberian ice and Appalachian fire, but his mind remained a fortress against the frequency. They are launching the Pioneers and the Voyagers, Viktor, Dr. Arisov said, his voice crackling over a secure analog line. The doctor was hiding in a monastery in the Swiss Alps, surrounded by thick stone and ancient silence. The public is being told these probes are ambassadors of peace, carrying golden records to explain humanity to the cosmos. It is a lie. The records aren't for the stars. They are homing beacons for the shroud. Volkov stared out the Berlin Wall, the gray concrete shimmering under the harsh spotlights of the death strip. They are inviting them back, aren't they? The politicians think they can negotiate. Worse, Arisov replied. They think they can harness the architect's transit system. The NASA programs and the Soviet Soyuz missions are being integrated into a project called the Glass Ceiling. They are trying to build a permanent gate in high Earth orbit. If they succeed, the architects won't need bridges or pillars. They will simply flow into our world like water into a cracked hull. The silent resistance had grown thin. General Silas Vance had disappeared into the deep black budget world of Project Blue Book's shadows, and Elena was a ghost in the system. But Volkov was still a soldier. He knew that if the gate was moved to space, there would be no more noise they could generate to stop it. The vacuum of space was the ultimate conductor for the architect's harmony. In 1975, the Apollo-Soyuz test project was announced. The first joint flight of the US and Soviet space programs. To the world, it was a handshake in the stars. To Volkov, it was a final calibration. He knew he had to stop the handshake before the orbital frequency was locked. Through a network of disillusioned defectors, Volkov managed to infiltrate the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. He wasn't there to sabotage the rocket. He was there to contaminate the cargo. He carried a small, pressurized canister of grit, a refined dust made from the shattered remains of the god-killer crystals. If he could release this dust into the airlock of the Soyuz capsule, it would act as a permanent acoustic toxin, vibrating at a frequency that would prevent the orbital gate from ever stabilizing. The night before the launch, the Kazakh steppe was a vast, silent ocean of grass. Volkov moved through the shadows of the gantry, his breath hitching in the dry air. He reached the maintenance hatch of the capsule, his fingers trembling. He wasn't the young major who had stood at sight 9 anymore. He was a ghost, a remnant of a humanity that was being phased out. "Stop, Viktor." Volkov froze. Standing on the gantry was a man in a dark suit. He didn't have the stiff, mechanical movements of the men in black. He moved with familiar, weary grace. It was General Silas Vance. But his eyes, they had that faint, silver shimmer. "You're one of them now, Silas?" Volkov asked, his hand hovering over the canister. "I am a bridge, Viktor," Vance said, his voice resonating with that terrifying double tone. "The architects show me the truth. We cannot win by fighting the frequency. We are part of it. The Earth is not a garden to be harvested. It is a cell in a larger body. The gate in orbit, it isn't for an invasion. It's for our ascension. We are being invited to join the harmony." Ascension? Volkov spat on the metal grating. "You saw what happened to Petrov. You saw what happened at the bridge. They don't want us to join them. They want to use us as fuel. They want to turn our souls into a power source for their dying sons. It is a better fate than what we are doing to ourselves," Vance replied, stepping closer. "The nuclear silos are still full, Viktor. The world is a powder keg. The architects offer a peace that surpasses human understanding. Give me the canister." "No," Volkov said. He triggered the canister. The grit didn't explode. It hissed out in a fine, shimmering cloud. But as the dust touched the air, Vance didn't flinch. He raised his hand, and the dust froze in midair, suspended by a localized gravitational field. "The environment has been prepared, Major," Vance said, his voice filled with a tragic pity. "The iron aegis you were so afraid of, it's already active. We didn't build a defense grid. We built a cage. And the key is about to be turned in the stars." Vance moved with a speed that defied human biology, slamming Volkov against the side of the capsule. The Major felt his ribs crack, the air leaving his lungs. But as he looked into Vance's silver eyes, he saw a flicker of the old man, a tear rolling down the general's cheek. "I'm sorry, Viktor," Vance whispered, his grip tightening. "The song is just too beautiful to ignore." Volkov felt his consciousness fading. The song was filling his head, louder than it had ever been. He saw the stars above the steppe, and for a moment, they weren't points of light. They were eyes, thousands of red and violet eyes, looking down at the earth with an ancient, cold hunger. But as the darkness closed in, a new sound cut through the harmony. It was a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the earth itself. The gantry began to shake, not from a rocket engine, but from a tectonic shift. Deep beneath the Cosmodrome, the old blood, the planetary defense mechanism that Arisov had theorized, was waking up. The planet didn't want the gate. The vibration was so intense that it shattered the gravitational field Vance was holding. The grit dust exploded outward, coating the gantry and the capsule in a layer of discordant crystal. Vance screamed, his silver eyes flashing as the acoustic toxin began to rewrite his hijacked biology. He stumbled back, falling from the gantry into darkness below. Volkov collapsed on the grating, gasping for air. He looked at the capsule. It was covered in the dust. The mission was a failure, but the contamination was absolute. When the Soyuz docked with the Apollo in orbit, the noise would be carried into the very heart of the orbital gate. The launch proceeded the next morning. Volkov watched from a distance as the rocket tore through the sky, carrying the seeds of human discord into the architect's perfect heavens. He knew he wouldn't survive the day. The men in black were already closing in on his position. He sat on a rusted oil drum, watching the trail of smoke in the blue sky. He pulled out a small battered radio and tuned it to a dead frequency. He didn't hear the song. He heard the static. Beautiful, chaotic, human static. "We are the grit," he whispered to the wind. "And as long as we can scream, the harvest will never be easy." The year was 1975, and the world was officially at peace. But in the silence of the Eldermurk, the architects began to realize that the silt of Earth was more than just fuel. It was a virus. And the war for soul of the planet was about to enter its most dangerous phase. The era of the 1980s, where the syllabus of the shadows would begin. By 1984, the world had changed. The grit that Viktor Volkov had carried into the stars during the mid-70s had delayed the architects, but it had not stopped them. They had adapted. They realized that physical gates and steel bridges were too easy to sabotage. To truly harvest a species, they needed to inhabit its mind, and the 1980s provided the perfect vessel, the digital network. The silent occupation was no longer about gray men in the streets. It was about the flickering green text on computer monitors and the invisible waves of the new global telecommunications grid. Dr. Elena Vance, now an aging woman living under a false name in a small town in Oregon, watched the rise of the personal computer with a sense of impending doom. She had spent a decade studying the residual echoes of the Silver Bridge collapse. She knew that the architects were no longer using the frequency to command humans. They were using it to code them. "They are building a digital shroud," she wrote in a journal that she kept in a lead-line safe. "The internet, the satellite constellations of fiber optic cables, they aren't for us. They are the new neurons of the architects. We are building our own cage, wire by wire, and we are calling progress." In 1986, the Chernobyl disaster sent a jolt through the resistance. While the world saw a nuclear accident, Elena saw a desperate, failed attempt by the remnants of Otto 7 to destroy a massive underground resonance array the architects had built beneath the Pripyat marshes. The explosion had been a last-ditch effort to jam the new digital signal, but the cost had been catastrophic. The radiation didn't just burn flesh. It acted as a catalyst, ionizing the atmosphere and making the shroud even more stable over Eastern Europe. "The noise is dying," a voice whispered from her radio one rainy Tuesday night. Elena froze. It was a recorded loop, a voice she hadn't heard in years. It was Viktor Volkov. The recording was old, distorted by decades of magnetic decay, but the message was clear. The architects are preparing the final syllabus. They aren't going to harvest our souls anymore. They are going to merge with them. The boundary between human consciousness and the digital network is being erased. When the World Wide Web goes live, it won't be a library. It will be the hive. Elena realized that the grit strategy was no longer enough. The architect had moved into a space where physical discord couldn't reach them. They were in the software. They were in the binary. Every 1 and 0 was being tuned to the rhythm of the Eldermurk. She reached out to the last surviving members of the silent resistance, retired engineers, disgraced generals, and former spies who lived in the shadows of the Cold War's end. They called their final operation Project Zero Sum. If the architects wanted a digital world, the resistance would give them one, but it wouldn't be the world they expected. "We can't kill the signal," Elena told the gathered group in a hidden basement in Seattle, "but we can poison the data. We have developed a logic virus, a piece of nonlinear code that mimics human emotion, irrationality, and chaos. If we can inject this into the backbone of the new global network, it will act like an autoimmune disease for the architects. It will force them to experience the one thing their perfect harmony cannot survive: doubt." The plan was a suicide mission. To inject the virus, they needed to access the primary satellite uplink at the Cheyenne Mountain complex, a facility that had been completely compromised by the men in black. The General Silas Vance was still there, but he was no longer a man. He was a primary terminal, a biological interface between Earth and the orbital gate. As the group prepared for the assault, the world began to flicker. Across the globe, people reported seeing ghosts in their television screens. The rhythmic tapping returned, But this time it came from the speakers of every radio and telephone. Tap, tap, tap. The countdown to the global sync had begun. The architects were ready to turn the key. "We aren't fighting for a country anymore," Elena said, loading a specialized data disk into a shielded case. "We are fighting for the right to be unpredictable. We are fighting for the right to be broken." The team moved toward the mountains under the cover of a massive, artificial blizzard, a distraction created by the last of the Soviet weather control satellites. The final battle of the Cold War wasn't between East and West. It was between the perfect digital eternity of the architects and the messy, chemical survival of humanity. As they reached the heavy blast doors of Cheyenne Mountain, the air turned violet. The shroud was descending, visible now even to the naked eye. The clouds were forming geometric patterns, and the stars were beginning to align into a giant, glowing eye. "The harvest is here," Aerosov's voice echoed in Elena's mind, though the doctor had been dead for 5 years. It was a memory, a phantom signal. "Don't let them tune you, Elena. Stay noisy." The doors hissed open, and the group stepped into the heart of the mountain. Inside, the walls weren't made of rock anymore. They were made of a pulsating, matte black material that hummed with the song. In the center of the command center sat General Silas Vance, his body fused with the mainframe, his silver eyes staring into a reality that no human was ever meant to see. "Welcome home, daughter," the general said, his voice 1,000 whispers. "The harmony is waiting for you. Why bring the poison when you can have the peace?" Elena gripped the data disk. "Because peace without a choice is just a grave, Dad." The final syllabus had begun. The world held its breath as the digital age prepared to swallow the human soul. But in the darkness of the mountain, a small group of glitches was about to pull the plug. The heart of Cheyenne Mountain had become a cathedral of alien geometry. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy, electric taste of the global sink. Elena Vance stood before the towering structure that used to be her father. General Silas Vance was no longer human. He was a living conduit, his skin translucent and shimmering with the data of 1 billion lives. The song of the architects was no longer a distant hum. It was a roar that filled the mountain, a perfect, crystalline frequency that demanded total surrender. "Look at them, Elena!" The general's voice echoed, though his lips did not move. Above them, dozens of monitors showed the major cities of the world. In London, Tokyo, and Moscow, the people had stopped moving. They stood in the streets, their heads tilted back, their eyes reflecting the violet shimmer of the descending shroud. The digital network was complete. The World Wide Web had become a web in the most literal sense, a trap for the collective consciousness of the human race. The struggle is over. We are finally one. No more war, no more hunger, no more chaos. Just the harmony. Elena looked at the data disk in her hand. It felt heavy, a small piece of chaotic iron against a tide of perfect glass. "It's not peace, Silas," she said, her voice small but firm. "It's a lobotomy. You've traded our fire for a cold light." The men in black moved in from the shadows of the command center, their movements synchronized and terrifying. They didn't use weapons. They simply projected the shroud's weight, a crushing psychic pressure that forced the resistance team to their knees. One by one, Elena's colleagues fell, their skin turning gray as the sink began to rewrite their neural pathways. Elena felt the song clawing at her mind. She saw visions of the architect's home world, a sprawling, dead empire of black glass where every thought was regulated and every soul was a battery. She saw the harvest for what it truly was, a desperate, dying civilization consuming the vitality of younger worlds to keep their own entropic darkness at bay. "Stay noisy," she whispered, the words of Volkov and Aerosov acting as a jagged anchor in her mind. With a scream of defiance, Elena lunged toward the primary uplink port. A man in black intercepted her, his cold, marble-like hand crushing her wrist. The data disk slipped from her fingers, sliding across the matte black floor toward the base of the general's throne. "The outcome was decided before you were born, Elena," the general whispered. "The architects do not permit variables." But as the general reached for the disk to crush it, a strange thing happened. The ground beneath the mountain began to vibrate with a frequency that wasn't digital. It was raw, tectonic, and ancient, From the shadows of the ventilation shafts, a figure emerged. He was old, his face a road map of scars, and his clothes were the tattered remains of a Soviet winter uniform. Viktor Volkov had not died at the Cosmodrome. He had become a ghost in the real sense, a man who had lived so long in the dead zones that the architect sensors could no longer see him. He was the ultimate glitch. Before the men in black could react, Volkov threw a small manual detonator, not at the uplink, but at the mountain's primary cooling lines. The explosion was small, but it was enough to trigger a massive release of high-pressure steam. For a split second, the room was filled with the chaotic, unpredictable movement of vapor and heat. In that moment of thermal noise, the general's grip on the digital reality flickered. Elena scrambled across the floor, grabbed the data disk, and slammed it into a manual override port at the base of the mainframe. Project Zero Sum active, she gasped. The logic virus didn't hit the network like a bomb. It hit it like a doubt. Across the globe, the perfect violet shroud began to shudder. The code wasn't trying to destroy the architects. It was introducing human irrationality into their system. It was feeding them poetry, contradictions, the feeling of a cold winter morning, and the sting of a lost love. It was a flood of data that had no mathematical solution. The song turned into a scream. Inside Cheyenne Mountain, the matte black walls began to crack. The silver light in the general's eyes turned a frantic, jagged red. The men in black collapsed, their biological shells unable to process the sudden influx of chaotic information. The orbital gate, visible on the main monitors, began to spin out of control, its geometric stability shattered by the grit of human emotion. "What have you done?" The general's voice fractured, the double tone splitting into 1,000 discordant screams. "I gave you your soul back," Elena said, tears streaming down her face. "And it's a mess, isn't it?" The sync failed. Across the world, billions of people suddenly gasped, their heads dropping as a mental chain snapped. The shroud in the sky didn't vanish. It burned up, the violet energy turning into a harmless, silver rain that fell over the continents. The architect's connection to Earth was severed, not by fire, but by the sheer weight of human complexity. Volkov walked over to Elena, helping her to her feet as the mountain groaned around them. The facility was self-destructing, the alien architecture unable to survive without the harmony. "It's over, Viktor," Elena whispered. Volkov looked at the monitors. The violet light was gone, but the world was still dark. The power grids were down, the satellites were falling, and the digital age had been strangled in its crib. "No," he said, his voice a low growl. "The occupation is over. The war is just moving back into the shadows." As they made their way toward the exit, they passed the remains of General Vance. He was no longer a terminal. He was just an old man, lying dead among the wires, a peaceful smile on his face for the first time in decades. He had died human. The Project Frostbite was finished. The architects had been pushed back, their harvest ruined by the very silt they had despised. But as the survivors emerged into the cold mountain air, they saw a single red eye watching them from the clouds. It didn't attack. It just watched. The Eldermurk was still there. It was in the static of the radio, in the shadows of the deep woods, and in the dreams of the children who had felt the song. We had won our freedom, but we had lost our innocence. We were now a species that knew its place in the food chain, and we were determined to stay at the bottom, where the grid is. You have been listening to the final decrypted files of Project Frostbite. This world you see around you, with its flickering screens and silent skies, is a fragile layer of glass over an ocean of shadows. The architects haven't forgotten us. They are simply waiting for the noise to die down. They are waiting for you to become quiet, to become predictable, to become tuned. If you want to keep the noise alive, if you want to stay informed about the secrets they don't want you to hear, then you must join the resistance. Subscribe to Eldermurk. Turn on the notifications. Not because we want to reach you, but so the signal stays broken. Share these files with those who still have eyes to see. The more we speak, the louder the chaos. And in the chaos, we are safe. Stay noisy, stay human, and never, ever listen to the song. This is Eldermurk, signing off for now.